Thank you for having me again. It's always good to speak with you. Just one small note, I don't know where that introduction came from, but I've actually written 26 books. And I only mention it because many of the newer ones may be of interest to your audience. Not only the history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, but also a historical study called Did Muhammad Exist? And the one that we are discussing tonight, which is called the Critical Qur'an. And I wanted to discuss a few things about the Qur'an in general in connection with this book. A lot of people, when it came out, asked me, why would we need another English translation of the Qur'an when there are already so many? And so I wanted to explain how many of the very common English translations of the Qur'an are actually quite misleading and even actively deceptive. And thus, the Critical Qur'an is an attempt to redress that problem and give non-Muslims an accurate view what the Qur'an actually says and how mainstream Islamic authorities interpret it. And so we can take, for example, the meaning of the Holy Qur'an, which is a translation from 1934 by a Muslim named Abdullah Yusuf Ali. And it is the most common translation of the Qur'an in the English language. And if you go in it to chapter 4, verse 34, it says, "Husbands are the protectors and maintainers of their wives, because Allah has given the one more strength than the other, and because they support them from their means. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. As to those women on whose part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last spank them lightly." So much for Abdullah Yusuf Ali. Now, actually, if you are familiar with the original Arabic text of the Quran, there are several problems with this. One is the word lightly does not appear. It doesn't say spank them lightly, and spank is a bit euphemistic because it gives the impression of a light striking such as one would give to a child, whereas the word is actually beat. And so in the Critical Qur'an, far more accurately, it says this: "Men are in charge of women because Allah has made the one superior to the other." You notice that the superiority was also not in Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation. The idea of Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation is to give non-Muslims the best possible impression of Islam, and that means to take out the parts that non-Muslims might find objectionable, not taking them out by actively removing them, but by obscuring them by how the translation is worded. So the Critical Qur'an is designed to do exactly the opposite of that, to give an accurate translation of the Arabic such that people can get a clear understanding of what it actually says. "Men are in charge of women because Allah has made the one superior to the other, and because they spend of their property. So good women are obedient, guarding in secret what Allah has guarded. As for those from whom you fear disobedience, give them a warning and banish them to separate beds and beat them." Beat them is actually what most of the translations into English say, and it does correspond more accurately to the Arabic. If you read Abdullah Yusuf Ali, you may not get the full extent of how the Quran teaches Muslims to treat women. And yet Muslims reading the Arabic of the Quran and knowing very well what it says, they treat women the way the Quran actually says to treat women, altogether too often. And so for that reason, it's important for non-Muslims to know and understand what the Quran actually says. A even more glaring indication of this comes from the very first chapter, the Fatiha, the opening, the exordium, which is the most common prayer in Islam. And Abdullah Yusuf Ali has it this way: praise be to Allah, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds, most gracious, most merciful, master of the day of judgment. Thee do we worship, and thine aid we seek. Show us the straight way, the way of those on whom thou hast bestowed thy grace, those whose portion is not wrath, and who go not astray. Now, so it's a prayer to go on the straight path, not the path of those who have earned Allah's wrath or the path of those who have gone astray. Who are they? If you ask Abdullah Yusuf Ali, he says the straight way is often the narrow way or the steep way, which many people shun. By the world's perversity, the straight way is sometimes stigmatized and the crooked way praised. How are we to judge? We must seek Allah's guidance. So you notice that he's not telling you who the people who have earned Allah's wrath and who go astray are. He goes on, are there two categories, those who are in the darkness of wrath and those who stray? The first are those who deliberately break Allah's law. The second, those who stray out of carelessness or negligence. All right, so that could be anyone. People who deliberately break Allah's law or people who do so out of carelessness or negligence. However, Islamic tradition is actually much more specific about who these groups are. And this is also important for non-Muslims to know. And so in the critical Qur'an, I have this, that the classic Qur'an commentator Ibn Kathir, who is he wrote a multi-volume commentary on the entire Qur'an that is still very popular today among Muslims, probably the most popular commentary on what the Qur'an says. And he says that the two paths he described here are both misguided, and that those two paths are the paths of the Christians and the Jews, a fact that the believers should be aware of so that he avoids them. The path of the believers is knowledge of the truth and abiding by it. In comparison, the Jews abandoned practicing the religion, while the Christians lost the true knowledge. That is why anger descended upon the Jews, while being described as led astray is more appropriate of the Christians. This is not just Ibn Kathir's understanding. The Tafsir al-Jalalain, the two Jalals, which is also a very popular commentary among Muslims even today. It originated in the 15th century. He says the grammatical structure here shows that those who are guided are not the Jews or the Christians. That is, the Jews and the Christians are misguided. The Persian scholar Nisaburi says those who have incurred Allah's wrath are the people of negligence, and those who have gone astray are the people of immoderation. But he's actually a minority among the commentators, most of whom identify the two offending groups as being the Jews and Christians. Now, this is quite important because the Quran tells us that the people who are on the straight path are to make war against those who are not on the straight path, those who have incurred Allah's wrath and those who have gone astray. And so the idea that the Christians are those who have gone astray and the Jews are those who have incurred Allah's wrath is much more than just a simple theological disagreement or an idea that their religion is correct and the religion of other people is incorrect. It is actually a mandate for warfare and subjugation that extends not only to the Jews and Christians, but also to all others. As we read in chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran, and this is something that pertains in particular to people who are not Jews or Christians, you will find the Jews and the idolaters the most vehement of mankind in hostility to those who believe. Now, that being the case, the most vehement in hostility of mankind to those who believe being the Jews and the idolaters, that directly affects, of course, the people of India, because Islam considers them to be idolaters. And that leads us to chapter 9, verse 28, which says, O you who believe, the idolaters are unclean. So do not let them come near the sacred mosque after this year. So if the idolaters are unclean and are the most hostile of all people, along with the Jews, toward the believers, you can see how, if you actually read this in your holy book and think that this is the word of the sole divine being, this is the perfect word of the creator of the entire universe, then you yourself are going to have immense hostility toward Jews and Hindus, because they are the ones who you are told by Allah are the most hostile to you. And so you are going to regard them with suspicion to begin with, if you are knowledgeable and devout in your religion, and see them as being a threat to your very existence, because they are the most vehement in hostility toward you. And so this is extremely important to keep in mind, that I think that what has been overlooked to a tremendous degree by political analysts when they are analyzing the situation in the political realm of various countries and the relationship between various countries and other countries, what is often overlooked is the fact that religious beliefs can have a tremendous impact upon how one understands political problems of the day. I mean, imagine if you read in your holy book, and if you were a Muslim and you believed all this, and you read in your book that the people who were the most hostile to you, who were going to cause you the most trouble, were the Jews and idolaters. And then you approach the problem of Kashmir, you're going to think of it in those terms. And the problem of minorities in Pakistan and Bangladesh. You see, if you're a Muslim and you see these minorities as being groups of people who are inveterately hostile to you, as the creator of the universe says, then you're going to be disposed not to treat them in a kindly fashion. And that has to do with your core beliefs. It's not a matter of geopolitical or any kind of political implications, any kind of political considerations. Take, on the other hand, chapter 109 of the Qur'an, and we will go back to Abdullah Yusuf Ali and see what he says. Chapter 109 is quite brief. It says, "Say, O ye that reject faith." That was another reason, by the way, that I wanted to publish the Critical Qur'an. Most of the common translations of the Qur'an in English are written in archaic English that no one speaks today. And so he says, "O ye," O-Y-E. People don't use that word anymore. That's you, but nobody speaks that way. And the idea, I think, in writing the Quran in this manner was, in the first place, to imitate in the West what was the most popular translation of the Bible at the time that Abdullah Yusuf Ali published his Quran, and that was the King James version of the Bible, which was written in 1611. And so it was written in the language of the day, and that was an English that we would consider archaic. But why? Surely it must have occurred to him, to Ali that is, in 1934, that people of his day didn't speak that way anymore. And Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, who also translated the Quran into English around that time, and his translation also remains popular, he also used this archaic language. Why did they do this? I believe that one of the reasons was to make it harder to understand. That they claim that they want to make the Quran clear, but when it's in English, then English-speaking non-Muslims can read it. And then they'll understand it. And then they will see just how dangerous the teachings of Islam can be for non-Muslims. And so if you have it in this language that people find difficult to understand, and tedious and difficult to read as well, then maybe they won't read it. For the same reason, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a very powerful group in the United States, they give you a free Quran if you ask them. And the free Quran they give you is about 2 or 3 times larger than my own critical Quran, which is a fairly large book itself. And so you have this massive volume. I think that also is designed to make it so that it's not easy to read, because people don't want to pick up a book of that size and page through it. Usually books like that are just for show. And so here again, you have an endeavor to try to appear to be being completely open about what the religion teaches when actually obscuring it. And so that brings us back to chapter 109. Say, O ye that reject faith, I worship not that which ye worship, nor will ye worship that which I worship. And I will not worship that which ye have been wont to worship, nor will ye worship that which I worship. To you be your way, and to me mine. Now that sounds on the face of it to be a statement of tolerance. And that's what Abdullah Yusuf Ali explains. He says, verses 2 and 3 describe the conditions as they were at the time when this surah, that's chapter, was revealed. Now that's very interesting. Did you hear that? Let me repeat that. Verses 2 and 3 describe the conditions as they were at the time when this surah was revealed. Now, if an English-speaking reader reads that and is not knowledgeable about Islam, then he will think that he's making simply a historical statement, that he's saying these were the conditions at the time when this chapter was revealed. But what he's actually saying is that these are no longer the conditions. That is, that this passage that I just read has been abrogated, according to the Islamic doctrine of abrogation, which comes from chapter 2, verse 106, which says, when we abrogate or cause to be forgotten a passage, we will substitute for it one that is just as good or better. And so this enables Islamic scholars to dismiss contradictions in the Quranic text, because the earlier passage is simply canceled. But if you don't know about the doctrine of abrogation and you don't understand that this is how Islamic theology works, then you're going to read that as a simple historical statement and not realize that this statement of tolerance from the Quran is no longer in force. And so once again, Abdullah Yusuf Ali is being misleading while giving the appearance of clarifying matters. And so he says that the passage can be paraphrased in this way. I am a worshiper of the one true God, the Lord of all, of you as well as of myself. But you, on account of your vested interests, have not the will to give up your false worship of idols and self. Verses 4 and 5 describe the psychological reasons. I, being a prophet of Allah, do not and cannot possibly desire to follow your false ancestral ways. And you, as custodians of the false worship, have not the will to give up your ways of worship which are wrong. The will in the translation represents less the future tense than the will, the desire, the psychological possibility. It tries to reproduce the Arabic noun agent. Now, he's going on about all that, but never gives you the impression that this is canceled and no longer in force, which would be all important if you're talking about tolerance in Islam. And you have so many Muslims behaving in an intolerant manner and behaving toward Muslims in anything but the idea of saying, well, I don't worship what you worship and you don't worship what I worship. And so basically, let's leave each other alone. Why he doesn't bother to even attempt to explain why so many Muslims don't take this seriously. And so in the critical Quran, I give you in the first place a much clearer translation of the passage. Say, O unbelievers, I do not worship what you worship, nor do you worship what I worship. And I will not worship what you worship, nor will you worship what I worship. To you, your religion, and to me, my religion. And I say, this entire surah with the culminating statement is frequently invoked today as one of the Quran's statements of tolerance. However, the Tafsir al-Jalalain, one of those commentaries I mentioned before, says that this verse was revealed before the command to fight came. This would mean that this verse's tolerance is no longer applicable. The 20th century Quranic scholar Muhammad al-Ghazali states, oppressing Islam and denying it the right to life cannot be tolerated. Of course, how one interprets oppressing Islam is quite a subjective matter. It must be explicitly stated that blood will continue to flow until this evil desire is removed and the power of Islam is restored and its Sharia protected and its complete implementation guaranteed. Do the oppressors understand? Well, we do now. Not to say that we're really oppressors, but this is how they are portraying us in order to justify the bloodshed. And then I go on to say a hadith depicts Muhammad saying, I have been commanded to fight against people till they testify to the fact that there is no God but Allah, and believe in me that I am the messenger from the Lord and in all that I have brought. And when they do it, their blood and riches are guaranteed protection on my behalf, except where it is justified by law, and their affairs rest with Allah. Their blood and riches are not protected if they do not embrace Islam. That is, they can be lawfully robbed and killed. Now, it would seem to me, I mean, obviously that's why I put it in the book, that this is an important thing for non-Muslims to be aware of, because it has tremendous implications for the relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. And yet, if you read the most common English translation of the Qur'an, you're not going to get this idea from it. One final example of how the Qur'an that is most common in English obscures what the Qur'an actually says is in chapter 53. Chapter 53 in Abdullah Yusuf Ali says, have you seen Lat and Uzzah and another, the third, Manat? What? For you, the male sex, and for him, the female? Behold, such would be indeed a division most unfair. Now, that's a very strange passage, and he explains it by saying, let's see, to show Allah in human shape, or imagine sons or daughters of Allah, that's what Lat and Uzzah and Manat are, as if Allah were flesh, was in any case a derogation from the supreme glory of Allah, high above all creatures, even if the human shapes were invested with great beauty and majesty, as in the Greek pantheon. But when we consider in what low opinion pagan Arabia held the female sex, it was particularly degrading to show Allah, or so-called daughters of Allah, in female shapes. So that's all. So that's what the passage is about, right? That it's just that some people are saying they're daughters of Allah, and they're wrong. However, what Abdullah Yusuf Ali does not tell you is that this passage is actually the notorious passage known as the Satanic Verses. The Satanic Verses is a real incident in Islamic tradition, and it was taken by the novelist Salman Rushdie as the basis for his 1988 novel, The Satanic Verses, which was declared blasphemous by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989. And a death sentence was put on Rushdie, which was finally carried out or attempted to be carried out last year when he was stabbed multiple times and severely injured when he was about to speak in New York State. Idea that he had blasphemed, however, is rather strange, because the Satanic Verses is a story, a genuine story from Islamic tradition. And so in the Critical Qur'an, I explain in the notes to chapter 53, the Satanic Verses, the actual incident from Islamic tradition. And it is in the biography of Muhammad that was written by Ibn Hisham, copied from the earlier biography by Ibn Ishaq, which goes back to the late 8th century. Now that is, mind you, quite a long time from the time of Muhammad, who's supposed to have died in the early 7th century, but that's a matter for another time. Now, what it says is this: the apostle, that is Muhammad, was anxious for the welfare of his people, wishing to attract them as far as he could. This is the Quraysh, the tribe in Mecca, in Arabia, and he was worried about them because they weren't believing that he was a prophet, and he longed for a way to attract them. And so the leaders of the Quraysh came to him with an offer. This was their offer: you will worship our gods, Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, for a year, and we'll worship your God for a year. And then, in response to that, he received, supposedly, a revelation from Allah. And the revelation said that it was legitimate for Muslims to pray to Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the three goddesses of the Quraysh. And this new message directly contradicted the substance of his preaching up to that point, because he had scorned Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat as false gods and proclaimed that Allah was the only God. But now he's suddenly saying that they're real, but they're not false at all, and that they can be worshipped along with Allah. And so the uncompromising monotheism of his message, up to that point, he completely threw out. And so at this point, he had a meeting with the Quraysh. The Quraysh were very happy with his new revelation, and they prostrated themselves in prayer with Muhammad and the Muslims. Ibn Hisham says the Quraysh were delighted at what had been said about their gods, saying, Muhammad has spoken about our gods in splendid fashion. He alleged in what he read that they are the exalted Yananik, that is cranes, the birds, the high-flying birds, whose intercession is approved. So this meant that they were near Allah's throne, and it was legitimate for Muslims to pray to them. Now then Gabriel, supposedly the archangel, comes to Muhammad and scolds him and says that he had fabricated all this. And so he repents and says that Satan had given him this passage. The devil had inspired this idea that the Muslims could pray to these three goddesses. So he canceled this passage and substituted it with the one that's in the Qur'an today. Have you thought upon Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third, the other? Are yours the males and his the females? That indeed is an unfair division. So it does have in the Qur'an now this idea of how silly it is that Allah has daughters. But Islamic tradition is quite clear that that passage originally was saying that those three could be worshipped as goddesses and daughters of Allah, and that this was later canceled, and Muhammad claimed that he had been inspired by Satan. Now, the problem is, if Muhammad could be inspired by Satan at one point, then who's to say that he wasn't inspired by Satan lots of other times as well? And so the entire passage is extraordinarily embarrassing for Islamic apologists today. But the fact is, it is in Islamic tradition. It's not as if the enemies of Muhammad or Islam made this up in order to embarrass Muhammad or make him look bad. This is recorded by believing Muslims. And apparently the idea is that Satan does inspire the prophets, and yet Allah always protects them. That would be something that one would invent, a story that one would make up in order to account for contradictions. That if one is receiving supposed revelations from Allah and a later revelation contradicts an earlier, then you could say, well, how could Allah, who is the perfect God, contradict himself? And then the whole thing falls to pieces. But then you make an excuse by saying, well, you see, Satan introduced that error, and now it's been fixed, and Allah always wins. And so the Quran also says in chapter 22, verse 52, we never sent a messenger or a prophet before you who, except when he recited, Satan would throw into it. See, Satan's throwing into the revelation that the prophets are getting. That is, he's interfering with it. And so Allah always abrogates what Satan proposes. Then Allah establishes his signs. The signs are ayat, the verses of the Quran. So Allah always protects the revelation against Satan. But if you have contradictions and internal disagreements, it's just because of Satan's influence. So it's clear that this whole thing is fabricated and false and designed to account for the contradictions within it. And Abdullah Yusuf Ali completely ignores all of that because he has apologetic intent. The critical Quran is just that. It's critical. It does not have the intent of making you think better of Islam, nor does it intend, for that matter, to make you think worse of Islam. It just wants you to understand how Islamic tradition and Islamic theologians depict Islam. And so that is the reason why I offered it. I hope that you're able to get it. Haven't been able to get a publisher in India. It's very complicated, but it is available at Amazon in India and so on. So I hope you're able to obtain it if you have interest in these things, and that at very least you'll understand that the standard translations of the Quran are not giving you the whole truth and are twisted in various ways in order to lull you into complacency about what Islam actually teaches. So thank you very much for...
I have a question first, Robert. It's not just about the interpretation of the Quran, but about the actual facts that Quran states that Islamic scholars themselves do not want to accept, or because last year we had this controversy in India. There is a BJP spokesperson called Nupur Sharma. She, in some TV debate, mentioned that Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 years old. And she has been given death threats, and she's become virtually, digitally invisible after that, because she's still receiving death threats. And there have been at least 2 recorded or 3 documented killings over those remarks or somebody who posted it. So I would like, this is not even a this is not even an interpretation. It's just what the Quran says. So what do the Islamists think?
There are various aspects of this. One is it's not in the Quran. I must emphasize that to begin with. That's not to say it's not in Islam. It's very much part of Islam. It's in the Hadith. Hadith means report, and the Hadith are the second authority behind the Quran for Muslims. Quran plus Hadith is what forms Islamic law. And the Hadith are very clear. It's repeated multiple times in what is considered to be the most reliable collection of Hadith. As a matter of fact, it's called reliable. Sahih Bukhari, Sahih means reliable. And so Bukhari Hadith is very clear in multiple passages that Aisha was 6 when Muhammad married her, and 9 when he consummated the marriage, that is when he essentially raped her because she was still a child. This is the basis for the idea of child marriage in Islam, which is in the Quran, although Aisha's child marriage is not mentioned. Chapter 65, verse 4 gives directions for divorce. And in it, the Quran says that these directions are also for women who have not yet menstruated. So the Quran envisions you marrying a child and even divorcing a child. So clearly child marriage is allowed in Islam. This is what embarrasses Islamic apologists today, because of course we understand nowadays all over the world that child marriage is damaging, can be severely damaging for little girls, both psychologically and physically, and that therefore it's a tremendously inhumane and destructive practice. Islamic apologists, being very well aware of this, do not want it known that Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6. And they take great pains to conceal the fact. And you will find many, many Islamic apologists explaining in convoluted ways how Aisha wasn't really 6, she was really 19 or something like that, and saying that Bukhari has it wrong. The ineluctable problem with all of that is that Bukhari's hadith is considered most reliable in all other contexts by Muslims, and clearly is also considered reliable in this context, since child marriage is so very common in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the Islamic world. So in light of the fact that Bukhari is considered reliable, all these apologetic attempts to explain it away fall flat. But there is also the concept of slander. And a critic of Islam is often accused of slander, even when he or she is telling the truth. Nupur Sharma was accused of slander. Why on earth would she be slandering Muhammad if what she said was simply what Bukhari says? because slander is defined in Islamic law not as telling a lie about someone, but as enunciating a truth that they don't want known. Enunciating a truth they don't want known. In India, the Muslims did not want it known that Muhammad had married Aisha when she was 6. Nupur Sharma said that he did. She was quite correct, but that's still slander by the lights of Islamic law because she spoke a truth they did not want known.
In fact, I believe there are writings by Aisha herself where she describes in great detail about how Muhammad went.
Yeah, that's in the Bukhari Hadith. She's quoted. The Bukhari Hadith date from the 9th century. And so here again, we have the problem of the historical value of all of this because it's 200 years after the fact. But there is no source that's closer. And also, Muslims take it as reliable. And so it is part of Islamic belief that all that is authentic. It only becomes inauthentic when non-Muslims start to notice it.
So probably they're right in believing that women should not be educated, girls should not be educated. They reveal too much.
Yes, they might do that and see that it's there.
I'll invite R. Karnik ji to ask his question and then I'll ask another one.
I have got 2 questions. The first question is about the changes that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi, which is the birthplace of Islam. He has brought in a lot of changes, effective this Ramzan. So what impact it is going to make on the future of Islam all over the globe? That's my first question. Is there any silver lining? Is there any, better future for people following Islam? That's first. Secondly, in the United States, you have a host of Islamic, the scholars like you who are bringing out the truth about Islam. For example, Hirsi Ali, Bridget Gabriela. I'm just 1 or 2 names, I may not be spelling it out correctly. In spite of all that videos and TV channels and writings, yet there are 2 ladies, Ilhan Omar, and there is one more, Rashida Tlaib, I suppose. They are senators or I don't know what you call them. They are more powerful. They are, influencing the government decisions and what is happening, in outside the world, in the academia, etc. And also the latest wokeism. And the wokes are, I keep hearing about the wokeism. Wokes are supporting, there's a sort of a unholy alliance between Islamists and the wokes. So what's happening? Would you kindly throw some light on? Because I have my brother, my wife's brother, there's so many Indians, so many, of my people. And what happens to them there, what happens in India, they're all impacting, influencing the others, So I thought I would raise these 2 questions with you. Thank you.
Thank you. In the first place, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has embarked upon a series of attempts to modernize Saudi Arabia. We have to understand, however, that it's unlikely that, actually virtually inconceivable, that there will be any massive change in the way Islam is practiced, either in Saudi Arabia itself or anywhere else in the world. What he's trying to do is reduce Saudi's dependence on oil, because it's very clear that the West is turning away from the oil-based economy and trying to reduce its use of fossil fuels. And consequently, the Saudis are seeing that their great wealth may dry up. And so he is trying, Mohammed bin Salman is trying to change the basis of the Saudi economy and attract foreign investment, not on the basis of oil, but on other things. But in order to do that, he has to open up Saudi society to some degree. However, in attempting to change the way Saudi society is constituted, he has to be very careful, because everything in Saudi is based on Islamic law. And the more he departs from that, the more he will get in trouble from the Islamic clerics, who will consider him a heretic. And I saw an interview with him where he was talking about modernizing. He was talking about a range of things, and he seemed completely calm and cool and in command during the whole interview, except when he was asked about modernizing Islam. And then he developed a very strange tic where he kept jerking his head up like that. And I was wondering if he was starting to feel uncomfortable in his neck, because he's aware that this is a very dangerous territory he's treading on, and he could end up beheaded for doing these things if he goes too far. He can try to reinterpret some of the aspects of Islamic law, but if he starts to change what the Wahhabi clerics consider to be core aspects of Islamic law, then he'll be removed. And so he's treading a very fine line, and it's unlikely that much will come of it in terms of genuine reform in Islam. In the US, the left is in power, the wokes, as you called them, and they are completely aligned with Islamic jihad, because the Islamic groups in the United States have very successfully portrayed them as a racial group. And that is that the majority in the United States are white, and the white people are supposed to be racist, and the Muslims are portrayed as all brown. Now, this is all nonsense, because Islam is not a race, and all the Muslims are not of one race, and there are white Muslims, but that doesn't matter for the narrative. The narrative is just that all the non-Muslims are white, all the Muslims are brown, and the Muslims are victims of racism. And so the left falls for this entirely and has taken on Islam as one of its protected groups. That's why their congresswomen, the two members of Congress, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, are very, very popular on the left. The people you mentioned, such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Brigitte Gabriel, are not considered to be reliable in terms of the witness that they have given about the nature of Islam. The left is much more interested in listening to people like Omar and Tlaib, who tell them about how Muslims are the victims and are downtrodden. We see the same victimhood narrative in India and elsewhere, that Muslims portray themselves as victims and in need of special consideration, when actually Islamic law grants rights to Muslims that are not granted to others, and puts the Muslims in a superior position. So you start talking in the West and in India about how Muslims need special consideration, then that's just paving the way for the superior position that they hold in Islamic law. And that's what the strategy is. So far, it's working very well. I hope that ultimately people will wake up to what's happening, but right now, virtually no one is aware in the mainstream of what's happening.
So, Robert, when Saudi economy was more oil-based, we used to ask how come they get away with so much human rights violations and women's rights violations. And the only plausible answer was it's all about the money, honey. And now when they are opening up the religion and the society, I believe it's still about the money, honey.
That's quite so. You look at the universities in the United States. I used to speak at universities quite often, and it was as if a tremendous villain had come to the campus. And I was always hooted at and shouted down, or they walked out. Everybody in the audience got up and left. It was always as if I was the problem, because I was calling attention to Islamic jihad. And I can guarantee you that any of these universities in the United States, if a jihad terrorist from Guantanamo Bay had come onto the campus, he would be treated as a hero. And this is because this is what they're taught by the professors in the universities. Why are they taught this? Well, if you look at who's funding the universities, Georgetown, Harvard, the most prestigious universities in the United States, get $10 million, $20 million from Al-Walid bin Talal, the Saudi sheikh, and others like him. Millions and millions of dollars. So it's very clear why they teach jihad is not the problem. Islamophobia is the problem. And Islamophobia doesn't really have any substance except what we were discussing before, telling truths that they don't want known. And so if you tell them, you're the great villain.
Okay. I didn't know this about the funding of universities. So they're playing the cards right, always.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Money is not spent on private jets and luxuries for the Saudi princes. It's also been spent on subverting the media and the academic establishment in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere as well.
I've talked to a few Muslims about the violent and perverted verses of the Quran and the Hadiths, and I've heard the following justifications. I want to know if you've heard these before and what your response would be to these arguments. So when I point out Surah 9:5, which is about killing the unbelievers, some Muslims respond by saying that the Prophet was at war. So it's okay to respond in the way that he did. And so next, when I point out Surah 9:29, which is about collecting jizya, they say that it was just a way to collect taxes. And he also said that modern states would extract taxes in a similar way. When I point out Surah 9:33, which is about the superiority of Islam to other religions, they would say that it's okay because everyone must believe that their religion is the best. And finally, when I said that Muhammad had a 6-year-old child bride, someone told me that it was common all over the world to marry women of that age in those times. So what do you think of these arguments?
Yes, these are very familiar arguments. I'll take the last one first, since we were talking about it a moment ago. Yes, it was quite common in the days of the early days of Islam for people all over the world to marry very young girls. The problem is that Muhammad, according to chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran, is considered the excellent example. That is, he's to be imitated in all things. If Muhammad is to be imitated in all things, it's very, very difficult, because nowadays you have half of the girls of second grade age and all of the girls of third grade age and up being married in Afghanistan. And as noted before, that causes tremendous psychological and physical damage to those girls. And this is happening because of Muhammad's example. And so Muhammad's example is not just a matter of history. It's not just a gotcha point for the 7th century that Muhammad married a child. The problem is that he's imitated today. This is why this is an issue that we need to be aware of, because it is the occasion for the abuse of children today. And so that's the problem with the issue about Aisha. Now, when you are talking about chapter 9, verse 5, and they say that Muhammad was at war, that's true. And there are many Muslims who will go farther than how you characterized and say, this is only for wartime and we're not at war now. And so this has no applicability. It only has to do with the conditions of the 7th century. And just so everyone knows, chapter 9, verse 5 says, when the sacred months have passed, kill the idolaters wherever you find them. Take them, besiege them, and prepare for them every ambush. But if they repent and establish prayer and give alms, then leave their way free. Now, the problem is that according to Islamic tradition, this is not something that only applies to the 7th century, but something that actually takes precedence over more tolerant passages such as chapter 109 that I discussed in the talk. For example, the first biographer of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq, in the late 8th century, he says that there are 3 stages of revelation in the Quran regarding jihad. The first is tolerance, which is superseded by defensive jihad, that is fighting back against the infidels when they attack the Muslims. And the third is offensive jihad, fighting against the infidels even when they don't attack the Muslims. And so you see, it comes from Ibn Ishaq and is also echoed and amplified by other Islamic scholars following him throughout history, that the final and lasting stage of the Quran's teaching on jihad is actually the warfare, the offensive jihad, not just defense and not tolerance by any means. And so it's just the opposite of what the Islamic apologists that you encountered said. And so if you say that these passages only have to do with the time of Muhammad, then you are contradicting what Ibn Ishaq, his first biographer, says. Ibn Qayyim, one of the leading Islamic scholars in history, even the Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia in the 20th century reaffirmed the same idea of the stages of development of the Qur'an's teaching on jihad, and repeated that it's warfare, offensive warfare, that is the final and lasting stage. As for 929, chapter 929 says, fight against those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, and do not forbid what Allah and his messenger have forbidden, and do not follow the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, the jizya is a tax. So is it just a matter of collecting taxes? And go here again, going farther than your Islamic apologists have gone, there are other Islamic apologists who will even say that the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, was less than zakat, the tax that Muslims have to pay. But the fact is, throughout history, human nature being what it is, people want to pay less tax, not more. And throughout history, there were actually several occasions, if you read the history of jihad, you will see several occasions where the Muslim rulers actually forbade conversion to Islam. And they forbade it because it would destroy the tax base. Because so many people were converting from their own religions to Islam in order to escape the taxes. If the taxes had been higher for the Muslims, they wouldn't have been doing that. They were doing it to escape the crushing taxes that the non-Muslims had to pay. Also, it's very clear from the Islamic scholars that the jizya was not just a tax, but was a symbol of the humiliation and subjugation of the non-Muslims. For example, the Bedouin commander Al-Mughira bin Sa'ad explained to the Persian commander Rustam that he must pay the jizya while you are in a state of abasement. And he said, you pay it while you are standing and I am sitting, and the whip is hanging over your head. Zamakhshari, another Islamic scholar, agreed that the jizya has to be paid with belittlement and humiliation of the non-Muslims. Now, you may find it humiliating to pay taxes today, but this is far beyond that. The 7th century jurist Sa'd ibn al-Musayyab, he said, I prefer that the people of the Dhimma, that is the people who are subjugated under the rule of Islamic law, the non-Muslims, become tired by paying the jizya, since he, that is Allah, says, until they pay the jizya with their own hands in a state of complete abasement. Another Islamic scholar, As-Suyuti, says that this verse is used as a proof by those who say that it is taken in a humiliating way, so that the taker sits and the dhimmi stands with his head bowed and his back bent. The jizya is placed in the balance, and the taker seizes his beard and hits his chin. So you're paying the tax, and the Muslim authority actually hits you while you're paying the tax. And another one even says that he spits on the non-Muslims while they pay the tax. So this is hardly just an ordinary tax payment where you fill out a form and send in your check. And 33 says, it is he who has sent his messenger with the guidance and the religion of truth, so that he may cause it to prevail over all religions, however much the idolaters may hate it. And your apologist said, this is just a matter of thinking your religion is true, and everybody thinks his religion is true. That's true to a certain extent, but there's more, because it's not just that Islam is to prevail over other religions, but that the Muslims must fight until Islam prevails over other religions. So chapter 8, verse 39 says, fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. So that's an unconditional declaration of war against non-Muslims who are to be fought until religion is all for Allah. And so this is why that's problematic. Islam must not just prevail through preaching, but through warfare. And so there's a constant state of warfare between the Muslims and non-Muslims, not because the Muslims started, but not because the non-Muslims started, rather, but because the Muslims do.
Robert, what does the Quran or the Hadith say about building of mosques on places of worship of other religions?
That is a very common practice that comes from the example actually of the early Muslims in India. And you can read multiple accounts of this in the history of jihad. The idea is to show that Islam has prevailed over other religions. And so you can see that it has its root in chapter 9, verse 33 of the Quran and chapter 8, verse 39 of the Quran that I was just discussing, that say that Islam must prevail over other religions. The Muslims in India immediately began to visibly show that Islam had prevailed over other religions. And it's not just in India either, of course. You have the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which date from the late 7th century, built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount being the site of the Jewish temple. Now, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in the year 70 AD, and so that was predating Islam. But when the Muslims, or the Arabs rather, conquered the city in the 630s, they immediately, well, not immediately, several decades later, began building these mosques on the site of the temple to show that Islam was victorious over Judaism, superior to Judaism, and had defeated it. And in Constantinople, when the Muslims conquered Constantinople in 1453, they immediately, on May 29th, the day that they broke into Constantinople and destroyed it, they sent the Sultan, Mehmed, sent a muezzin into the church, my goodness, I'm sorry, into Hagia Sophia Church, which was the grandest, largest church in the Christian world, and proclaimed there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger in it, and it became a mosque. And after about 80 years as a museum, it was converted into a mosque again in 2020 in Istanbul. Now, that also is to show that Islam has conquered Christianity and is superior to Christianity. And as I said, in the history of jihad, there are multiple accounts of the destruction of Hindu temples and the destruction of the idols, the breaking of the idols into pieces that were then laid out in front of the entrance to the mosques, so that the Muslims would trample on the gods while they walked into the mosque. And this is all to show that Islam has prevailed over other religions, as the Quran commands.
I'll quickly go to two more questions we have. One is from Aditi.
I have a two-part question. In my life, I have come across a few Muslims, some public figures, some otherwise, who are very devout Muslims, have studied their texts and practice assiduously. And their understanding is that a lot of the messages from both Quran and Hadith are misinterpreted. They seem to be making reasonable points, like pointing out terrorism, extremism, happen to be open-minded, kind people. I've seen one such gentleman on Twitter called Vasik, who works against Islamists. So how do we reconcile their approaches to the flaws pointed out in Islamic texts as though they are inherently intolerant of non-Muslims? That was my first question. Should I ask the second one now or later?
I might forget it. Do you mind if I answer that one and then we go back to you?
Not at all. Absolutely your choice, please.
I appreciate that. Many times I've had people ask me lengthy compound questions, and I end up forgetting the second one in the process of answering the first. I actually must say I was very pleased with myself, if I do say so myself, when the gentleman asked a very lengthy question that involved both Mohammed bin Salman and the situation in the United States, and I was able to remember both. That was a great victory. In any case, there are many people who say they are devout Muslims and that they reject terrorism. This is very common. I'm not familiar with the individual you named, but there are quite a few people of this kind in the United States and elsewhere. And I must say, I'm sorry to say, that there are so many passages in the Quran that actually have to do with terror in itself. For example, chapter 8, verse 60 says, if you'll give me a moment, I'll get there. chapter 8, verse 60 says, make ready for them all that you can of force and of war horses, so that by them you may strike terror in the enemy of Allah and your enemy, and others besides them whom you do not know. Now, I've heard Islamic apologists say this doesn't mean terror like terrorism, it means terror like the fear of God. But you're using war horses and force. So it's very clear, actually, that you're talking about war. And that means you're talking about something much more akin to terrorism than the fear of God. Chapter 8, verse 12 also says, when your Lord inspired the angels, I am with you. So make those who believe stand firm. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Then strike the necks and strike their fingertips. Strike the necks, that's cut off their heads. So once again, the terror he's striking in the hearts of those who disbelieve is not the fear of God, is not awe at the presence of God, but it is terror, like terrorism. Chapter 3, verse 151, we will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve because they ascribe partners to Allah. That's what Muslims understand Hindus to do by having a multiplicity of gods, ascribing partners to Allah. So their dwelling is the fire, and wretched is the dwelling place of the wrongdoers. We will cast terror in the hearts of those who disbelieve. It's very clear. And it's very clear from also the fact that all the various sects and schools of Islamic jurisprudence teach that Muslims must wage war against unbelievers and subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law, which denies them basic rights. So these people, I don't know what they are up to. Either they are trying to interpret the Qur'an in a way that it has not been interpreted in Islamic tradition, which is possible, or they are being actively deceptive, which is possible, or they are deceived themselves, which is also possible. I don't know which one it is, but the fact is that there is no theological tradition or legal tradition in Islam today, or any time in 14 centuries, that teaches peaceful coexistence as equals with unbelievers. It does not exist. And so whatever they may be doing, they do not have a theological leg to stand on in Islamic tradition.
Thank you for answering that, Robert. There's a lady in Saudi Arabia. Her name is, I'm not sure, I hope I don't mispronounce, Noof Marwai. And I have heard that she pioneered the teaching of yoga, albeit removing Hindu symbols like Om, etc. I'm just wondering, how is it that extremists do not view her as kafir, who is disrespecting Islam in the holy land of Islam, no less, while they are focusing on everyone else all over the globe? I'm trying to understand how do people like that get away when she's herself a devout Muslim? If you could share any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm not familiar with this lady, but I suspect that the answer is in your question. And that is that you said that she took out the aspects of yoga that pertain to Hindu belief. And consequently, it's just a series of exercises. And so as a series of exercises, nobody can object. It's just like doing push-ups. So nobody minds. If she's talking about yoga as it has been traditionally understood, I suspect she would get in quite a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I just wondered because in India, somehow, if you mention anything related to Hinduism, even if you strip it off a lot of its spiritual heritage, even then everyone a lot of Islamists it just ignites them big time. So I was wondering, even she took yoga, people know it's from India, even if she removes the quote unquote Hindu elements and she practices it, people know it's from there. It's known all over the world. And I'm wondering, how is it not setting off these people? I'm glad it isn't for her sake, but I'm just not able to get it. Is it because they see India as a Hindu majority country and they're really targeting and they're thinking, well, Hinduism is not going to take over Saudi Arabia. No, dangers there. I don't know. What would you think of that?
I'm no expert on yoga. However, it is quite common in the United States. And certainly I've heard of it for many years. And I know that there are many people who practice it who know that it is from India and may even know that it has a spiritual dimension in India, but still approach it as a series of exercises that have nothing to do with the spiritual realm. And so while I'm not entirely sure that that's the case, because as I say, I'm not familiar with this lady you're referring to, I would suspect that that is the answer, that most people are not aware of the actual derivations of yoga as being part of religious practice. They might know of it as from India, but think of it as a series of exercises from India. And that's it. And so they don't think of it as being incompatible with Islam or Christianity or anything else.
If time permits, I have two questions you can answer. The first question is on Iran. The hijab revolution that took place, will it eventually, bring transformation in Iranian society and they go back to Zoroastrianism, and that will set a trend in the world? That's the first question. The second question is in India, Indian political, when BJP came to power in 2014, we all thought that, we Hindus, we thought that, BJP with its parent organization, RSS, new change would be ushered in. But lately, Prime Minister Modi has added another word to sticker and appeasement. Earlier, what Advaniji used to say, he came out with the word triptikaran, that is fulfillment, satisfaction, or whatever it is, one step ahead. And then also all those ministries, minority ministry, minority commission, work act, everything is intact and they're all standing, and a huge, budget allocation for minorities. And then the latest approach is Paswanda approach. Whereas on the RSS side, Mohan Bhagwat goes on releasing books and books written by Muslims. And then recently one fellow has written an Urdu translation of Atharva Veda, and is a filmmaker. I don't know how qualified he is. So, and there is a Rashtriya Muslim Manch in RSS. So we are left high and dry. That's the feeling I get. Whom to vote? So what's from America? How do you look at these developments? Because with the huge population, Muslim population in India, Indian subcontinent, it will have an impact the world over about the relations between Islam and the other societies. So your take on this, how do you?
Yes. I'll take the second one first. I'm no authority, and I can't pretend to be any authority on politics in India. I can only say that a policy of appeasement is something that it may be that the Indian government is being pressured to undertake because the governments of the United States and Western Europe are so deeply committed to appeasement at this point that they seem to think that that is the sole policy that any government should take vis-a-vis its Islamic population. So that may be the reason why the Indian government has taken this path, that it's being pressured by governments with which it wants to maintain good relations. Other than that, all I can say is that I think that all of the governments that are practicing appeasement at this point all over the world are eventually going to regret it, but that it's probably going to be too late for some of them when they begin to do so. As far as Iran goes, Iran, of course, has a very long secular tradition in the 20th century. Reza Shah, the father of the Shah who was deposed in 1979, patterned Iran after Turkey. And Turkey, under Ataturk, actually rejected political Islam explicitly and modeled its society after the secular societies of Western Europe. This was after World War I. Ataturk very forthrightly said that the Ottoman Empire lost World War I and fell because of Islam and was a decaying, weak society because of Islam. And he wanted to reject Islam to modernize Turkey. This is something, of course, that the Turks themselves are now rejecting as in turn and returning to Islam. But in Iran, the opposite is happening. The people are tired of the Islamic Republic. They have lived under Islamic law now for 40 years. And it's very clear that they understand deeply how inhumane it is, how destructive of the human spirit it is. And it's still within the lifetime of people. I was 17 years old when the Shah was overthrown. And so that was quite old enough to remember. If I had been growing up in Iran, there are people my age now who very well remember what it was like to live under a secular society, and they have no doubt told their children all about it. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Islamic Republic fell. Here again, however, the governments of Western Europe and the United States want very much for that not to happen, and they want to keep the Islamic Republic in power. Why? Well, for one thing, because they're committed to this policy of appeasement, and they think that they can do business with the Islamic Republic that will be mutually beneficial to the Western Europeans, the Americans, and the Iranians. And I think that's extraordinarily foolish and wrongheaded, but it may be that they'll prop up the Islamic regime in Iran and it will not fall. We'll see.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Spencer. As always, a very illuminating talk. And as always, I always get sidetracked to an issue other than the one you've spoken, because some of the things that you expound on are so profound, it makes us think about things in the larger perspective. So this is kind of more of a comment than a question. I'm not sure how best to frame it, but I'll discuss it. So in India, we're seeing sort of a Western-sponsored onslaught in terms of raising radical elements. And since this topic is about, radical Islamism, if I can put it that way, in India, we have the Barelvi tradition, right? And the Deobandi tradition, of which the Taliban is an offshoot. So we are seeing how what a dangerous trend that could, set. And in addition, the way the United States bungled up Afghanistan and what's happening right now, the point that you just made based on the gentleman's question earlier was that, that they think they can do business. They try to do it with the Taliban, and look what happened. But it's mind-boggling how, with all the wisdom and the intelligence sources they have, they're making the same mistake and kind of, trying to light up powder keg in India. And it's only going to blow back on them, because the way, if you look at Southeast Asia, right, India is kind of the last frontier that wasn't conquered by radical Islamism, despite the repeated efforts of 1200 years. But the way things are going, it's kind of, we do see a sort of a multiple Western government-sponsored balkanization efforts of India, in India rather, which have offshoots, utilizing Islamic extremism as one of the tools. So I just wanted to know your opinion as to why this, it's kind of, you put your finger in fire, get burnt, and you put it again. So I just wanted to know your opinion, if you could, I would say, advise us based on your wisdom and knowledge of this subject matter as to why this is happening, and, what could be done to sort of circumvent it or, raise awareness against it. This was one of...
Seems to have cut out there, but in any case...
Yeah, sorry. You may answer the first part of the question. Mohit, I will unmute you again.
International left is in the ascendancy, and they're in power in the United States, all over Europe, and elsewhere. And they are deeply committed to the idea that the problem that the world faces vis-a-vis Islam is not jihad and the supremacism of Islamic law and the universal declaration of war against non-Muslims. The problem is Islamophobia. And that means some sort of irrational dislike of Muslims. And so they've committed themselves to policies to redress Islamophobia and grant special accommodation to Muslims. Here again, it seems to me that they are being very skillfully manipulated by Islamic groups that portray themselves as victims and claim these special accommodations on the basis of this spurious victimhood. But as a result of this all is not just wrong attitudes. It's being enshrined in policy in all manner of ways all over the world. And it seems to be the guiding principle of the foreign policy of the United States and of Western Europe regarding Islamic states and Islamic groups in other countries. And so it's always that the Muslims must be appeased and accommodated, and they're always understood as victims. And no amount of casualties of jihad attacks seems to dislodge these fundamental assumptions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Doctor. And I just had the second question was again more related to US domestic geopolitics, because, you know, if you look at the Biden administration and all the Democratic contenders, including Hillary Clinton, they always had aides or advisors who sort of had ties with the radical elements we are just talking about. With Hillary Clinton, not to make any accusations, but there were talks about Huma Abedin and her family, having ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. So what's happening is that, you know, the Democrats have given a huge platform to Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, but the right keeps, if I talk about the Republicans, they keep falling into the trap by going too extreme on the other end. And I don't think either party gets it, which is why whichever administration comes into power, they keep making the same mistakes as you have just alluded to. Do you believe that, the elections that are coming up with 2024, the Republicans come back? Do you see a tempering of the policy of appeasement, or is it going to be business as usual? And that was my last question. Thank you.
I would disagree with one aspect of your question, and that was that the Republicans go too far on the other side. Actually, it seems to me that the Republicans and the Democrats both practice the same appeasement and consider Islam in the same light, as a religion of peace that's been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists, and that the fundamental problem is their victimhood. It's just that the Democrats are more tied in with the Islamic groups, but the Republicans are not offering any serious alternative. They long ago embraced the same false assumptions about Islam and Muslims. It's not as if Republicans have been somehow hostile to Islam or to Muslims. And of course, hostility is not what's called for. Realism is what's called for. But that's in vanishingly short supply in both parties. So I don't think that if, in the very extraordinarily unlikely event that Republicans won the 2024 election, then nothing is going to change vis-a-vis Islam. Trump was in power already from 17 to 21, and he didn't want the United States involved in a lot of these endless wars, and that was all to the good. But in terms of being aware of what was going on with the manipulation of the foreign policy establishment by Islamic groups, he showed no awareness and took no action.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Spencer. And I do agree with you on that point about the Republicans. But it's just that, despite of several, inputs by the CIA and the FBI, etc., nothing is being done. So that's a little concerning, because as you see, there are a lot of radical elements attacking, the Hindu population in the West. And we are seeing an increased spate of those attacks happening. So that's why the global Hindu diaspora is a bit concerned. But thank you again. Adding later.
Well, that's a matter. That's a function of the influence of the Islamic groups and of the millions pouring in from Saudi Arabia into the universities. Suddenly the universities have seminars about the dangers of Hindutva when they never have seminars about the dangers of jihad, even though there are 40,000 jihad attacks worldwide since 9/11 and no Hindutva attacks. This is the influence of these Islamic advocacy groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations and their funders from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And so the problem is that the leftist establishment is completely tied in, linked to these groups, and the Republicans are essentially controlled opposition at this point and useless in terms of any genuine response.
Right,
Sorry,
thank you.
End on a negative. Yes. But that is the situation. We have to understand what the situation is before we can move to fix it. We have to be realistic about where we are before we get to where we want to be.
Very nice. If you would like to kind of make some closing remarks.
Yes, the Qur'an is the topic generally of this discussion today. And so it's very important to remember that the Qur'an is a very great influence on the actions of Muslim individuals and groups. Most of the time, analysts who are not Muslim completely discount the Islamic aspect of various conflicts, when as far as the Muslims go, it's the key element of the conflict. You can take, for example, Israel and the Palestinians constantly talk about Islam when they're talking about Israel. And yet everyone else in the entire world, when they talk about Israel and the Palestinians, completely ignores Islam. I expect that's largely true of the situation in India as well. And so I would exhort you to become familiar with the teachings of Islam and the Quran, because they will illuminate a great deal of the geopolitical situation in a way that the analysts who are in power do not understand.